My name is Dahlia Wasfi. I was born in New York, but spent my early childhood in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. My father is originally from Basra, Iraq, which is Iraq's second largest city in the south near the border with Kuwait. He was born and raised there, came to the U.S. for graduate studies, where he met the woman who would be my mom, nice Jewish girl from New York. So I was born in New York, lived my early childhood between Iraq and the States, and then came back and lived my life since 1977 here in the States, which is why I have this accent rather than a foreign one. And I've been back to Iraq now twice, for 3 weeks in 2004 and for 3 months in 2006. And on the basis of my experiences, I call for the immediate unconditional withdrawal of American forces from Iraq. My talk today is the effects of war and occupation on Iraqi farmers, basically that there ain't nothing green about the green zone. All right, let's back up a little further than 1971. This is between 2000 and 3000 BC. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the green zone. The Fertile Crescent, outlined for you in green. Obviously tracking the paths of the two major rivers that run through Iraq, modern-day Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates. This is, of course, Mesopotamia back in the day. And just as a note, you can see in the lower left-hand corner that between 2000 and 3000 BC, that's Palestine. Israel was a state created in 1948. But also in this image, you can see in the lower right-hand corner the major early cities of civilization. This region is known as the Fertile Crescent. It's known as the cradle of civilization. And sorry, I don't have my pointer. Here's my pointer. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, if you're close enough, the city of Ur, Sumer, and Babylon. Now, the land of Mesopotamia was once troubled by significant flooding, which limited the amount of farming that was possible. But today, the land is mostly desert. And farmers made efforts to control the floods so that they could build their crops. And today they have to deal with the desert conditions. But farming in ancient Iraq goes back for 10,000 years, back to 8000 BC. And this influenced development of the whole society. These were the first farmers, the ancestors of the people who live in Iraq today. And farming led to development of clothing, trade and commerce, and writing. For clothing, the people used wool, or they grew flax and made clothes from those materials. The farmers at that time, the very first farmers, they invented irrigation. And so for the very first time, thanks to irrigation, there was a surplus of crops to trade for goods and services. They were using the barter system, which, depending on how fast the dollar devalues, we may be going back to the barter system shortly. Writing was also developed by those first farmers, because with the surplus of crops, they needed a means to keep track of their selling and buying, and also how much they had. So they kept records for livestock and records for commerce, and this was cuneiform, the first system of writing. Now, some of you may not know, I didn't know until I started researching it, that modern-day Iraq is the site of the biblical Garden of Eden. I see heads nodding. That's so, thank you. Thank you for that. And most people, this should have been discussed at the time that we were getting ready to shock and awe. Abraham, considered the father of the three major monotheistic religions, was from Ur. Now, my dad says Abraham was an Iraqi. That might be pushing it a little bit, but nevertheless, this is a connection that most of us have to this part of the world. As I said, the major early civilizations, these are the people who developed the concept of the 24-hour day, the basis of writing, the first system of mathematics. These are, of course, Arabic numerals that we use. The basis of law, science, and medicine, actually 7,000 years of civilization. That was all accomplished without the help of any Americans or British. It's true. It's true. It happened. This is a pictorial of what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon may have looked like, built by Nebuchadnezzar II in 600 BC. For many years classified as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Actually, this was not built through a no-bid contract to Halliburton. So I just want to assure you that if you're concerned about what will happen with the reconstruction of Iraq when American businesses and the military leave, I feel confident that the descendants of the people who did this can probably come up with something. All right, farming in modern-day Iraq. We're going to fast forward about 9,000 years. In the 20th century, it was predominantly traditional, family, multi-crop farming. Now, since the 1950s, Iraq was known as the date supplier to the world, with producing over 400 kinds of Iraqi dates. I remember when I was little, I thought I was going to get in so much trouble because I picked up something off the ground that looked like chocolate, and I ate it, and it tasted like chocolate, but it was a date. I never told anybody because I picked it up off the ground and ate it. But anyway, flourishing date agriculture sector. Once over 35 million date palms in Iraq, now according to the Department of Defense, less than 15 million, thanks to the occupation. Now the 1970s, this was the time when my family was living there. I was there between 71 and 77. This was, relatively speaking, these were the golden days for Iraq. The Ba'ath Party, under the direction of Saddam Hussein, who was technically the #2 guy, but he was really running the country. They nationalized oil between the years of 72 to 75, and fast forwarding a little bit, 2003 was payback for Iraqis taking control of their resources and, God forbid, earning profits for the people who lived in their country. At the time, one Iraqi dinar was the equivalent of over $3 American, and the dollar was doing pretty good at that point. Now, there was political repression, no question. If you challenged the regime, or if anybody got a whisper that you were challenging the regime or the Ba'ath Party, something would happen to you. You would be jailed, tortured, imprisoned, disappeared, who knows. So absolutely, you knew you had to watch what you would say and be careful not to ask the wrong questions. But if you remained apolitical, the economy was doing very well, and there was free health care and free education all the way up until 2003. Now, in the 1980s, we left in 77. 3 years later, in 1980, the Iran-Iraq War started. Then Iraq shifted to a war-based economy, which is essentially what we've been operating in since the 1940s, at least. Basra was heavily bombarded. Basra, there were a lot of contested areas very close to the border with Iran there and the Fao Peninsula. So Basra was hit very hard. So we actually could not go back during that time because it was wartime. But my cousins told me that electricity supplies, water supplies, food supply generally remained stable. And now this war continued for 8 years through most of the 80s with the contribution of American funding and armaments for Iraq over the table, for Iran under the table. Little secret we kept from Congress. But that was the whole Iran-Contra scandal. Oh, people. December 20th, 1983, Donald Rumsfeld, then private citizen, special envoy to President Reagan, reaffirming our close ties with our ally in the Gulf, Saddam Hussein on your right. People, you can feel the love in this picture. December 20th, 1983, the Iran-Iraq war is well underway. Saddam Hussein is using the chemical, biological, and conventional weapons that we're providing him with, as well as satellite intelligence. This should have been plastered all over the news when Rumsfeld was calling him a tyrant worse than Hitler. Not that he hadn't earned a reputation for being a brutal tyrant. That was well deserved. But clearly, at some point, it didn't make a difference to us. After the 1980s, Iraq was preparing a $40 billion reconstruction program. But then for reasons I can't go into, I don't have time to flesh out right now, Iraqi troops moved into Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. What resulted was economic sanctions imposed on Iraq 4 days later, August 6th, which I'll come back to, and subsequently the Gulf War that began on January 17th, 1991. It continued for 42 days. Now, I currently live in Denver, Colorado, because I grew up on the East Coast, and I don't deal well with 3 consecutive days of rain. We bombed the people of Iraq for 6 straight weeks. No let-up. 88,500 tons of bombs. We did target electrical grids, we did target water sewage treatment plants, we did target telecommunication centers, all of which are illegal by the Geneva Conventions. The public health infrastructure was destroyed because it was known as the jewel of the Arab world, a first world system of healthcare. I didn't know until I started doing the research, but Iraq actually had a healthy tourist industry for people coming to get their medical care in Iraq. But as you can imagine, in the first world system we have in this country, take away electricity and spill sewage in the streets, and what do you have? You have massive disease outbreak, communicable diseases, and you're unable to run your hospitals. We also use depleted uranium. I will come back to this. And this basically was the beginning of the devastation of life for Iraqis. Moving on a little further, the period of August 1990 through March 18th, 2003, the day before shock and awe, was characterized by suffering imposed by economic sanctions, bombings, marsh drainage, and drought. So let me start with the sanctions. As I said, they were imposed on Iraq 4 days after Iraqi troops moved into Kuwait, actually on the anniversary of another government's targeting of a civilian population, the 45th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. What those sanctions did was blocked Iraq from selling its oil, which was 95% of the economy. This also blocked the import of goods. There was no new, from the farming standpoint, no new agricultural equipment coming in. And any equipment that needed to be repaired, infrastructure that needed to be repaired, this was not possible because of economic sanctions. The food rationing program in Iraq was started at this time, and I want you to keep that in mind because I'm going to come back to that. This was the food rationing program that was begun in 1990 and persists through this day, and in the chaos and displacement and starvation that's happening in Iraq, many Iraqis are relying on what's left of the food rationing program to survive today. By 1995, 5 years of economic sanctions, what was found was that those sanctions were yielding a minimum of political dividends against a high human price paid primarily by women and children. Now, do the math with me. Take any country, any population, about half male, half female. Add up the women, the girls, and the boys. That's the majority of the people. Anywhere you go, women and children. And women and children were paying the highest price, as they are today. Now, what would we do if another country's policy affected, primarily targeted, women and children? We'd be hopping mad. The food rationing system at this time was providing less than 60% of the required daily caloric intake. People were starving. Saddam Hussein got fat during this time. He wasn't hurting. The regime wasn't hurting, and in fact his power was reinforced because people were that much more desperate to and dependent upon him for their survival. So we actually strengthened his rule with the years of sanctions, but the people suffered. Which people? The same people who suffer today in Fallujah, the same people who suffer today in New Orleans, those who are very young, very old, very weak, very sick, very poor. These are the elements. This is the population that suffers the most. Water and sanitation systems were still in a state of collapse. This is a study in 1995 by UNICEF. So what this study led to was the Oil for Food program that was supposed to start in December 1996. As we all know, even if it had been working 100%, it would have been a drop in the bucket to satisfy the needs of the Iraqi people. But we know it was rife with corruption. As I told you, Saddam Hussein was making a lot of money, selling oil on the black market. Who was he selling it to? At that time, Dick Cheney was CEO of Halliburton. Everybody's getting a cut. There was also, through this time, an intellectual embargo. Not only were foods and services and any imports blocked from entering the country, but also journals, medical journals, agricultural journals. So no new farming technology was coming into Iraq. By 1997, UNICEF found that nearly 1 million children in southern and central Iraq were chronically malnourished. And the reason I'm going through all this is because this is the state of Iraq. This was the setup before we came in 2003. This is an increase of 72% since 1991, when American forces and an embargo were involved. And the UNICEF rep in Baghdad said, "It is clear that children are bearing the brunt of the current economic hardship. Those children are now young teenagers, and they will be ripe to join the resistance when all they know of Americans are those planes that drop bombs and the political people who starve them to death." So this is the result of malnutrition in Iraq. Iraq, again, prior to the 1980s, was emerging as a first world country. The 70s were very good, but today, starvation. You could see, and to this day, see anywhere from between 2 and 5 babies in one incubator. Number one, they fit. Number two, if an incubator breaks, they can't get the parts to replace it or bring in a new one. That's blocked by the embargo. And number three, because we targeted electrical grids, for the rolling blackouts, it requires less fuel to run the generator for one incubator than 2. This was the malnutrition in Iraq. This was the state of Iraq's children. So also through this time, we were bombing Iraq. A lot of people forget about that, but the no-fly zones were actually bombing zones. This was indiscriminate bombing, and I will show you through one example of Omran Jawer, that 8 years ago yesterday, he was tending his flock of sheep. He had just finished school for the year and was getting ready for summer vacation. 13 years old, living in a small rural village, farming town in southern Iraq, about 30 kilometers outside of Najaf. This was Omran, and on that day, American planes were circling overhead and, for whatever reason, launched an attack that injured 4 of the other shepherds who were with him and his relatives, killed Omran, and also killed between 20 and 30 of his flock. Now, this image is actually from Afghanistan in 2006. But for a population that is suffering, poor, and starving, when we come in with aerial assaults that do this to their source of livelihood, their source of survival, this has a tremendous impact on the people living there. They don't hate our freedoms. They hate us because our policies are destroying their lives and killing their families. Marsh drainage. Now, this is actually on something that the Ba'ath Party was doing. After the first Gulf War, there were uprisings in southern Iraq because we encouraged the Shia leadership in the south to go rise up and remove Saddam Hussein. And we said, go ahead, we will be there to back you up. And so they said, okay, we're going. And then the Americans never showed up. And for some time, there continued to be rebellion in the south. So what followed was systematic drainage of the marshlands just north of the city of Basra, where my father is from. Now, the party at the time said that they were doing this because there were drought conditions and they needed the water for irrigation. But in reality, it was likely to displace those people who were rebelling against the government. And this resulted in drying up the wetlands and mass displacement of the people. And also during this time, as if matters were not bad enough, nature contributed with a drought. Between 2000 and 2003, there's now a new drought today. I'll come back to that. This reduced the wheat crops to less than half of the grain production that had existed 10 years before. And the population, therefore, became more dependent on the food rationing system that was coming from the government. So, but in that period, with economic sanctions and bombings and marsh drainage and drought, it's estimated that between 1.2 and 1.8 million Iraqis died. The percentage equivalent for a population of 26 million compared to a population of 300 million, that's as if another country's foreign policy killed almost 14 million Americans. Absolutely devastating. And now here we come to shock and awe. These are my pictures. This is from March 2004. This was the Ba'ath Party building in Basra, which was targeted as a government building. You can see the devastation that, we make really good bombs. And they can destroy buildings. And you see physically what can happen. We can only imagine the noise trauma of a bomb hitting. But this is 2004. Ladies and gentlemen, I returned 2 years later to visit my family, and after 2 years of reconstruction, here is the new Ba'ath Party building. This is what Iraq looks like. There is devastation throughout the country. The only construction that's taken place is, number one, on military bases that belong to Americans and British. Number two, building walls to create ghettos in Baghdad to divide up families and workers, especially in Sadr City. Iraq's seed industry, going back to the agricultural aspect. Before 2003, they had a well-functioning, centrally controlled seed industry that had developed over the years a rich seed variety for almost every variation of wheat in the world today. And the farmers in Iraq accomplished this by saving their seeds and sharing them and replanting them. Well, after 2003, that system was destroyed. The research and seed production facilities had significantly deteriorated, also by years of sanctions as well as looting. They had a national seed bank that had seeds dating back thousands of years since the early farmers. It's gone now. And now the supplies of seed demand are supplying only 4%, and that's back in 2005. Now, Paul Bremer came in after the invasion, and you may know Bremer's 100. If you do Pilates, that's a little bit different from the Pilates 100. This is Bremer's 100. That's a joke for those of you who don't do Pilates. His first 100 orders, which were decreed, and no elected Iraqi government that comes after Bremer has the power to alter them, which is apparently the foundation of a democracy in someone's book, not the dictionary. Anyway, Order 81 is important because it affected the agriculture in Iraq, and it's got a legal name: Patent Industrial Design, Undisclosed Information, Integrated Circuits, and Plant Variety Law. Well, through all the legalese, basically what Order 81 says is that farmers shall be prohibited from reusing seeds of protected varieties or any variety mentioned in items 1 and 2 of paragraph C, blah, blah, blah. So basically what it says is Iraqi farmers are not allowed to save seeds. They are not allowed to share seeds, no sharing, and they are not allowed to replanted harvested seeds. Now, why would Paul Bremer do this? Well, let me tell you a little bit about Monsanto. Monsanto has terminator seeds, genetically engineered seeds that, as you probably know, produce plants that do not make seeds, which makes farmers dependent on the corporation for seeds every year. Now, Monsanto and Dow Chemical and the Cargill Corporation, they all have an interest here because they're all manufacturing either the seeds or the chemicals to treat those plants with. And they need a place, a laboratory, if you will, to try out their new toys. So, Cargill Corporation, a grain conglomerate, their former vice president, Daniel Amstutz, was made the agricultural advisor to Iraq, also a former USDA official. Now it was very staggering to me and also very clarifying for me to understand that across the board, from agriculture to mercenaries to oil, this is about corporate profit. And these corporations were like drooling on the possibility of using their terminator seeds there. Iraq becomes the laboratory for genetically modified wheat. They gave Iraqi farmers 6 types of wheat to grow, only 6. 3 of them are for wheat for pasta. Iraqis don't eat pasta. So a population that is starving to death is given seeds to make half of their production for exports. And who's going to make money off of that? Not Iraqis. They are the guinea pigs in this experiment. And despite the food insecurity that is at heightened, desperate levels today, the food rationing system that started back in 1990 is due to be terminated next month. That's thanks to the influence of the World Bank and the IMF. This means starvation, which pushes people to be more dependent on any crumbs that the corporations hand to them. Sick and wrong. So daily life for Iraqi farmers today, there's no law and order. They're living in chaos. Daily house raids, they continue to this day by Iraqi police, and they're supervising American soldiers. There is limited electricity and water, which means that there's no irrigation. You need electricity to run the irrigation. And what water is available is contaminated with sewage, so you can't really use it to irrigate your crops. Now there is a new drought that is emerging, which is heightening the food crisis. The American-run Ministry of Agriculture is doing nothing to help out the farmers. IEDs have a particular plague for farming towns. For example, the town of Haditha. In Haditha, an improvised explosive device went off, killing a Marine. The rest of his unit responded with great anger to avenge that murder and massacred 24 people, the families who live nearby. When a roadside bomb goes off, the instinct is fight or flight. Well, unarmed farmers in their fields are going to flee. And many American soldiers take that as a sign of guilt, and they get shot in the back. There's no accountability over there. It is Lord of the Flies over there. And so the only option is to bring the soldiers home. Environmental destruction, as I said, now there's less than 15 million date palm trees today, according to the Department of Defense, and our use of depleted uranium. And I know I'm running close on time. But if you don't know it, then depleted uranium is basically radioactive waste. We have tons of it stockpiled around the country. I live in Denver, so please come visit. We have depleted uranium stockpiles. We have nuclear missile silos. I'm going to work for the advertising board for the state of Colorado. But anyway, DU, as it's called, happens to be the most dense material on Earth. The only natural occurring element that comes close is tungsten. And that's very expensive to mine, and we don't have that in this country. There are a lot of resources in Russia. But what the Pentagon found with all this free stuff sitting around, actually it's not free because it costs money to maintain radioactive waste. But they found that if you formulate that DU into rods or tip it on artillery shells or put it into a gun that fires 50mm caliber rounds, specifically in the rod shape, it can cut through a tank like a hot knife through butter, which is very, very exciting if you are the Pentagon. But there's a problem beyond my problem with fighting wars. But on impact, DU burns and aerosolizes, just like spraying a spray can. And it goes into tiny, tiny microscopic particles that go into the air and the sand, and for the people, the water supply. Now, after the first Gulf War, where we used over 300 tons of depleted uranium in southern Iraq and Kuwait, the Pentagon sent their #1 geophysicist to go check out what the results were, Major Doug Rockey. And what his findings was that you should never have used this, you should never use it again, you need to educate the civilian population on what we've exposed them to, and you've got to educate returning soldiers on what they've exposed them to. Well, ladies and gentlemen, depleted uranium is our Agent Orange. The Pentagon says that depleted uranium is fine. You can eat dinner off of it, which maybe you can. Maybe the head of the Department of Defense likes to go home and eat off of dinner plates of depleted uranium. More power to him. But in reality, when you breathe it in and you drink it in, it's going to settle in your lungs and your kidneys. And then the tiniest pieces will be able to cross into the bloodstream and go systemic. The most likely etiology of Gulf War syndrome is depleted uranium. And this waste is radioactive. The Pentagon said, Doug, thank you so much for all your hard work. You're fired. Now, the effect for the returning soldiers is a population of between 1 and 2 million, which is probably, well, certainly since 2003. For Iraqis, you have an entire population that has been subjected to DU. And studies done in 2002 at the Veterinary College of Basra University found the onset of new cancers in animals in Basra. Seminoma in rams, mesotheliomas is lung cancers in buffalo, and ovarian cystadenomas in dogs. So if it's affecting animals, it's affecting people. And in Iraq, after the first Gulf War, there was a 600% increase in Iraq's infant mortality rate, and 300% increase in the incidence of pediatric leukemias and lymphomas, which are blood cancers. And now that shock and awe has come, I said after the first Gulf War, we used a little over 300 tons of depleted uranium. Today, over 2,000 tons and counting. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it was also used by NATO in the bombing of Kosovo. And now the increased cancer rates, which had been concentrated in the south after the first Gulf War, which is where bombing was concentrated, are now appearing in Baghdad. For American soldiers, as I said, most likely cause of Gulf War syndrome is exposure to depleted uranium. A third of soldiers who have served in Operation Enduring Freedom are now presenting to the VA for medical complaints. And the VA cannot handle it. That's not even psychological trauma. That's medical complaints. And what it led to, it was found that there was significant increase in the congenital abnormalities in the children of veterans of Desert Storm, 1991. Normal children before Desert Storm, after their service, children with abnormalities. Actually, I forgot to tell you, the point of my website is to back up the information I tell you because it's so different from what you'll hear in the mainstream media or absent there. So there's a section on further reading And there's a section on depleted uranium, and you will find the life photo essay called The Tiny Victims of Desert Storm. Or you can do a search on your own. You don't have to go through my website, but I'd like you to. But anyway, this is documentation that the significant increase was being followed, but then there was no further funding to continue the studies and make definitive epidemiology. Because if what happens to those children is a result of their father's service, which for those cases it was their father's service, then they're owed benefits. And that is not something that this government wants to start paying out. And in Iraq, these are the victims. Now, because of sanctions, you would need, for treating pediatric blood cancers, you usually need multiple rounds of multiple drugs. Well, the doctors in Iraq would have one drug, but not the drug for following rounds. So the fatality on the pediatric oncology ward in Iraq during sanctions was 100%. Even though the cure is out there, you can't bring the therapy into the country. Again, women and children pay the highest price, but we rarely see images of women and children in the media because we would have compassion for them. And we are often shown young military-aged men, armed, militant, dressed in black, angry. We can't see their faces because they're wearing the headscarf to cover it up. That's the image we see. We don't see the majority of the people, the women and children, who bear the brunt of war and occupation. So what do? How do we help Iraqi farmers and families? Immediate unconditional withdrawal of foreign military forces from Iraq. That's step one. We can't even talk about anything else before then. We got to pull the knife out of Iraq's back for there to be healing. How do we do that? I don't know. If I had the answer, I would have given it to you at 1 o'clock. But this is my suggestion for something you can do. Support the troops who resist. There are close to 20,000 soldiers who've gone AWOL, saying, I'm not going to go back. And they don't want to make a public stand. You put a lot on the line when you make a public stand. But those who do, there's around 100 now. One of them very recently, after veterans testified on Capitol Hill, said, I'm not going back to fight your war based on lies so Dick Cheney can make more money. You can find out more about them at couragetoresist.org. You can read about their profiles. If one particularly speaks to you, and if you don't already have a direct connection to what's happening in Iraq, send these people a letter of support. They are putting themselves on the line, following their hearts and their conscience, and obeying their oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, including those terrorist cells in Washington, D.C., more commonly known as the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The other group I want you to know about is IVAW, Iraq Veterans Against the War, now over 1,000 strong, asking for 3 very simple things: immediate withdrawal, take care of the troops when they get home, and pay reparations to the Iraqi people. They have seen firsthand the devastation that's been done in our name, so we would be wise to listen to them to try to make up and start the healing. Whatever your passion is, obviously you have an environmental interest because you're here. I want to congratulate you for selecting the most important speaking event and coming to hear me today. But wherever your major interest is, follow your heart and speak out, because if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? Thank you all so much for your attention. If you have more questions, please write me at liberatethis.com. They say you're supposed to repeat it. Comments, questions, love mail, hate mail, anything. Thank you. Thank you so much.